Hello AP Bio students, this is Mr. Laudermouth. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you as the case may be. This is part 2 of our lecture on ecosystems and ecosystem dynamics. Let's start with a quick review of some things I mentioned in the last lecture, which is the fact that in an ecosystem you need two inputs in order for organisms to thrive. You need energy and nutrients, but they don't follow the same pathway, they don't behave the same way. For starters, we know nutrients are recycled because of that law of conservation of mass. We talked last time about some of the ways nutrients are recycled. We looked at phosphorus, carbon, nitrogen, and water moving through an ecosystem. In contrast, energy flows through an ecosystem. It can be stored in one form of energy or another, like say chemical potential energy, for a while, but eventually all the energy that was captured from sunlight is going to be lost as thermal energy, as heat. And thermal energy is not useful energy. It cannot be used to do the work to keep an organism alive. It cannot be used for growth, reproduction, etc. So for that reason, there has to be a constant input of energy to keep an ecosystem going. Let's look at that process in a little more detail. So there's the sun, the provider of energy for nearly every ecosystem on planet Earth. Of course, down at the bottom of the oceans and some of those ocean trenches, you have communities based on chemical energy being released from some of those hydrothermal vents, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Let's just look at a typical land-based ecosystem. So producers, aka plants, are using sunlight energy to make their own food. They're doing a process of photosynthesis. Some of that energy they capture, though, they will lose as heat. Now, primary consumers, your herbivores, feed on the bodies of these producers and incorporate their nutrients and their stored energy in order to run their own bodies. But part of that transfer involves a loss of energy as heat. There can be secondary consumers, we call these carnivores, who feed on the primary consumers, the herbivores, incorporating their nutrients and their stored energy, but in the process of transfer, some of that energy gets lost as heat. We can keep this food chain going. In the case of some aquatic food chains, there might be 10 or 15 separate links, but in each case, a transfer of energy from one organism to another always requires a loss. That's the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, and there's no getting away from it. Just because it's a law of physics doesn't mean it doesn't apply to biology. It certainly does. We live in a physical world. So, that brings us to something you studied in quite a bit of depth back in 9th grade, that is food chains. So this should be primarily a review, I hope. When we're looking at food chains, what we're really looking at are feeding relationships, or what we call trophic levels. We start with energy coming in from the sun. That energy gets captured by plants. They're at level 1 of all food chains. Or in some aquatic ecosystems, this might be algae or photosynthetic bacteria, but it has to be a producer. Level 1 of your food chain has to be an organism capable of taking sunlight energy and making its own food. Those producers then become food for consumers at level 2, who can be food for consumers at level 3, food for consumers at level 4, and on and on. On land, most food chains only go up to 4 or 5 levels because of this loss at every step. So producers get eaten by primary consumers, who get eaten by secondary consumers, who get eaten by tertiary consumers, and it could continue on from there. Now, connecting all of these levels together, because again, nutrients have to be recycled, are the humble decomposers. We often forget about them because we often don't see them. Bacteria, of course, are microscopic. We sometimes see mushrooms, but even then, a lot of the work being done by fungi we don't see because it's happening below the surface of the soil. But they are taking the dead bodies of these producers and consumers, using them as a food source, using them for energy, but in the process, taking all the stored nutrients in their bodies and returning them to the soil to be used by a new generation at level 1, a new group of producers. So it's important to note here, when you're drawing food chains or food webs, the arrows always have to show the direction of energy flow. So energy is flowing from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer. try not to get too hung up on the who eats who. Make sure your arrows are showing the direction of energy flow. If they're drawn correctly, it will show the correct feeding relationships because energy is passing from this organism to that organism. And back to decomposers. Organisms that are capable of producing their own food we call autotrophs. Those that have to eat other living things for food, whether they're herbivores or carnivores, we call them heterotrophs. And of course, the sun is the sun. So, why the loss here? Why can't we get 100% transfer of energy, say, from this leaf to the body of this beetle that's eating the leaf? Well, keep in mind here, some of that energy, yes, will be used by the organism to power its own growth. So some of it is being turned into what we would call biomass. That is what's available at the next level in the food chain. If some organism like a bird was to come along and eat that beetle, it would get some share of the 17% that the beetle put into its own body growth. But if we look at the rest there, about 33% of the energy this beetle took in, it lost during cell respiration. It lost as heat. That's unavoidable. Another 50% was lost as waste through its feces. There's not completely efficient digestion and absorption of energy. If there were, these organisms could grow much faster and probably much bigger, but about half the energy they took in just kind of left almost immediately as a waste product. This again explains why we have to have a constant input of energy from the sun. You know, if this beetle was able to take 100% of the energy from the leaf and use it, it might only have to eat once a week. But instead, because it's only keeping a small fraction of it, it has to eat much more constantly, much more continually, which means the plants are going to have to keep growing to replace the leaves they lose to these herbivores, and the only way they can do that is capturing more energy from sunlight. So there's no getting away from the need for this constant energy input. So being a living organism does entail a daily loss of energy through waste and through metabolic processes, and there's just no way to avoid it, leaving you a very small portion to actually go into your own biomass, to fuel your own growth, your own reproduction, etc. And that's the only amount that's going to be available to move on to the next level in the food chain. So, why we got to lose this energy? It's just the cost of being a living organism. It's the cost of being alive. We can actually take this concept of energy loss and use it to build ecological pyramids. We sometimes have pyramids of numbers showing the number of producers, number of primary consumers, number of secondary. We can draw the pyramid in terms of energy, though. And that's what this pyramid is showing here. We start with 1 million joules of sunlight. Well, only about 10,000 of that is being captured by the primary producers. In this case, it ends up being about 1%. From there, about 1,000 joules of the energy then passes to the primary consumer. So going from producer to the consumer, you can see there's a transfer of only about 10% of the energy. From there, only about 10% makes it from primary to secondary consumer, and then 10% of that makes it from secondary to tertiary consumer. This passing on of just 10% of available energy from one trophic level to another, we often call this the 10% rule. And it's a good benchmark if you're trying to figure out, for instance, how many, say, secondary consumers your ecosystem can support with a given number of primary consumers. It's a way of estimating sort of max population sizes, estimating carrying capacities. There are other factors involved, of course, water, shelter, etc. But in terms of pure energy loss, 10% is a good benchmark to follow. So we end up having fewer animals on each level because there's just less energy available at each level to feed them. Yes, there's a constant input of energy from the sun, but you can't escape the second law of thermodynamics. About 90% of it is being lost as heat at each step. And that results in our pyramid shape to our ecosystem. Okay, Are humans part of food chains? Well, we are. Again, we live in the same physical world as all these other producers and consumers. So how much energy does it take to feed a human? Well, let's assume that we're all going to be meat eaters. Then we'll look at the case of what if we're vegetarians? If we're going to be meat eaters, you'll notice that the energy stored in the producers, in this case corn, has to then pass into some primary consumer, in this case cattle, whom we then eat. But if that 10% rule is true, only 10% of the energy is passing from corn to cattle, and then only 10% from cattle to humans. So that means of the energy that got stored in the corn we grew, we're only ending up with about 1% of it. It's pretty inefficient. If everybody were vegetarian, however, we could then capture about 10% of the energy stored in the corn, 10 times more efficient. So you can kind of see from this diagram here, if everybody on the planet Earth suddenly decided to switch to a vegetarian diet, it would actually be much easier to feed everybody because there wouldn't be this loss of energy by sending it through some other organism first. It would probably also reduce the price of food for people who live in impoverished areas, and it would probably make transportation much easier too because we wouldn't need refrigeration, at least in some cases, that we need now to ship all this meat around. Okay, let's look at a bigger picture here. If you take all the food chains in one particular community and show them all in one diagram, you have a food web. Now the food web can help answer questions about who eats whom. You'll notice many species here are part of more than one level. So for instance, if we look at the leopard seal, which is kind of just top center of this diagram, leopard seal is right here. You can see that that leopard seal can eat fish. The fish in turn can eat copepods, herbivorous plankton, who fed on phytoplankton. But that's not the only food chain that can end at a leopard seal. The leopard seal could have eaten a bird, like a penguin. That bird could have eaten krill, and the krill could have fed off the phytoplankton. You've probably guessed that the phytoplankton in this diagram are the primary producers. They're taking the place of plants, this being an aquatic ecosystem. They, however, still have chloroplasts and can still capture sunlight energy and make food. The leopard seal then can be food for other organisms, in this case small-toothed whales, so they can be part of other food chains as well. Any organism that eats meat often eats more than one food source, so can be part of one food chain. Bears, humans. We, of course, can eat meat and plants, putting us at a couple different levels on a food web. And that's kind of ending our quick overview of the inputs of nutrients and energy to ecosystems, as well as sort of a quick review of things you studied back in 9th grade, food webs and food chains. Hopefully this has refreshed your memory, and if you have questions, bring them to class.